Hey, everybody. It is Wednesday, March 12th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And sometimes, Jill, we make day trips from New York to D.C. on the train early in the morning and then back in the afternoon so you don't have to gather the headlines.
And you still make the podcast.
Still make the podcast. Still record the podcast for the next day. Jill, it was quite a commute. Took the train. Always my favorite way to get down to D.C., especially when it's running on time. Had some meetings on Capitol Hill yesterday, and we'll tell you about one of the reasons it was a consequential day on Capitol Hill in terms of preventing a government shutdown. But had an opportunity to meet a bunch of folks on the Hill, including members of Congress, including a number, Jill, who follow this podcast.
Well, hello there, Congress members who are following the Mo News Podcast. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, gentlemen and gentle ladies, for listening, for following us on Instagram. As increasingly, Jill, we're finding that in Washington, they're recognizing that they got to be reaching out to creators, to new media, as the audiences continue to diversify where they get the news. And I guess the easier way to say, leave legacy media and come to new places like this. So we have several folks, Jill, eager to come on and chat with us here.
And Moshe, before we get started, also want to mention it's Girl Scout Week. March 12th is the day to celebrate the founding of the Girl Scouts back in 1912. Juliette Gordon Low registered the first 18 members. I myself, never a Girl Scout, but I do appreciate a good Girl Scout cookie.
Yeah, which one's your favorite?
Thin Mints. And by the way, you mentioned Thin Mints, I think last week on the podcast when we were talking about mint chocolate Oreos. And my husband, I saw that he bought mint chocolate Oreos, and he's like, Moshe.
Look at me. I just would like, I would like, is it Nabisco that owns Oreos? I would like them to know that we are influencing at least your husband to buy their product. If they would like to help advertise here on the Mo News Pod. Jill, you didn't ask, but I will tell you my favorite Girl Scout cookie is Tagalongs, the peanut butter ones.
Interesting pick. I think most people say Thin Mints, right?
Thin Mints, I think, are the most popular. I'm not against, I'm a fan of Thin Mints, but you had taken Thin Mints, and I just wanted to diversify the podcast today. So, I think on any given day, I might take a Thin Mint or I might take a Tagalong. The peanut butter, delicious.
Okay, let's get to some news. More than 3 years after Russia invaded Ukraine and 2 weeks after President Trump threw Vladimir Zelensky out of the White House, Ukraine says it accepts a 30-day ceasefire. But will Russia agree?
Yeah, over to you, Putin.
To Wall Street, where the market freefall continues as President Trump's trade war creates uncertainty.
Jill, trying to track these tariff headlines, honestly, I know that some people professionally have to do it on Wall Street, but for news purposes, I might just wait till the end of the day these days because so much is developing hour by hour.
But that's part of the problem, and we're going to talk about it, but that's the issue. You would think that markets would be happy about fewer tariffs, but it's that back and forth that's also creating so much chaos. Speaking of chaos, government shutdown averted, maybe. The House passes a bill to fund federal agencies through September, but its fate in the Senate is unclear.
Yeah, we'll tell you what they were saying on Capitol Hill to me yesterday.
Meanwhile, President Trump buys a Tesla at the White House. That's not a Mad Lib, Moshe, that's real.
No, yeah, that was real. He turned the White House driveway yesterday into sort of a dealership, we'll explain.
To the Menendez brothers case, the new LA district attorney asks the court to withdraw the motion to resentence them, meaning the new DA wants to keep the Menendez brothers behind bars. The NTSB makes some urgent safety recommendations after that deadly DC plane crash, what changes they want to make to Reagan National Airport. Sticking with travel, Southwest getting rid of its most recognizable perk. Free checked bags. It was good while it lasted, Moshe.
Oh, Southwest. What have you done?
And a viral airport trend has travelers arriving at a gate just minutes before takeoff. Moshe, I would be in such a panic.
If people read the newsletter, you wrote about it yesterday.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, a bit of history about one of my Broadway favorites, your Clue. Do you hear the people sing?
I know that one.
You know that one. Many of you probably do.
Okay, let's start with international news. Ukraine agreed to a 30-day ceasefire deal proposed by the United States on Tuesday, following more than 8 hours worth of talks led by the United States in Saudi Arabia. Secretary of State Marco Rubio led the U.S. delegation. He says now it is up to Russia to accept the agreement. Moshe, what a remarkable turnaround, given that less than 2 weeks ago, President Trump essentially threw Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky out of the White House and cut off intelligence sharing and some military aid.
Yeah, that infamous White House meeting. Zelensky was pushing back on any deal. Trump literally kicked him and his delegation out, saying that they don't want peace. I won't deal with them until they want peace. Ukraine on the outs there. Since then, we had the apology to Trump, now this meeting. And here you have Zelensky essentially flipping the script here. The Russians were living high on the hog, excited about this divide between Ukraine and the U.S. Now he's come closer to the U.S. He's accepted this ceasefire position, significant, and now it's put the challenge over to the Russians.
So after Ukraine signed off on the deal Tuesday, the U.S. said that it will be lifting the pause on intelligence sharing and resume security assistance to the country. A joint statement from the U.S. and Ukraine says that Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the U.S. proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended if both parties agree. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says it is now up to the Russians to get on board.
We'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes, to peace. The ball is now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
Moshe, President Trump also commented on the deal at the White House, calling on Russia to sign off. And he was asked if he would invite Zelensky back to the White House. And he said, sure.
Yeah, we've kissed and made up, and we're ready to talk again. Now, the big question, of course, is, will Russia support a ceasefire here? Keep in mind this acceptance by the Ukrainians, interesting move. And it comes as Russia occupies about 20% of Ukraine. For Americans, that's land the size of Pennsylvania that the Russians currently occupy. But notable, the Ukrainians made a point in the last year of invading Russia to get some leverage. And so they have a small piece of Russian territory in Kursk for this exact moment, basically a potential land swap, land trade there. And so it's going to be really interesting to see the next move here vis-a-vis the Russians. As I mentioned, they were loving the fact that Zelensky was kicked out of the White House, that there was this divide here. The Russians have doubled down on their bombing of Ukraine recently, killing a whole bunch of civilians, targeting energy and a bunch of civilian targets across the country. It led to a point recently where Trump this week tweeted against the Russians, saying, I'm going to increase sanctions on you if you guys don't get your house in order. So there is this unpredictability to Trump that he touted that potentially will surprise us in these negotiations. Ultimately, Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's envoy to both the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine situation. Steve Witkoff, one of the busier men in the world right now. He met with Putin back in February for about 3 hours. He's set to return to the region this week, so we'll closely watch that and see what comes of it. According to a statement from the U.S. and Ukraine yesterday, as far as what's next here, they would each name their negotiating teams and immediately begin negotiations toward an enduring peace that provides for Ukraine's long-term security. Also here, the Ukrainians have decided to move ahead with that mineral agreement. Remember, Trump wants access to tens of billions of dollars in Ukrainian minerals in exchange for continued support here for Ukraine. But much more important for Zelensky is security guarantees. He and Ukrainians have now lived through multiple Russian invasions over the last 10 years, multiple times where Putin has broken deals and invaded or not kept deals. And so for Ukraine, it's super important. They say, listen, we'll sign a deal here, but you guys got to make sure this guy does not invade us again once Putin is able to rearm, get his military in order. We don't want to be dealing with yet another invasion. So the security guarantee is going to be super important. It's one of the reasons why Ukraine has wanted NATO membership. That does not appear to be happening here. The U.S. doesn't want that to happen, and they have the ability to block it in NATO. The Russians, again, the ball's in their court here. They've invaded multiple times. As far as Putin is concerned, he wants all of Ukraine. So the question he's going to have to ask himself is, how will he frame this to the Russian people as success? After 3+ years, hundreds of thousands of Russians dead. You know, he's now been left to use military equipment from Iran and North Korea and stuff from the 1960s as far as this war effort is concerned.
He needs to basically write an email to the Russian people with his 5 accomplishments from the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
what, I think you make a great point. What did it accomplish after 3 years, countless deaths, a lot of money?
Well, he took 20% of the country, right? So you can declare that a success. The thing about Putin is he's not in a democracy, he's an authoritarian regime. So he doesn't really have to explain that much, but he just has to sort of sell like, hey guys, this was totally worth it. And what comes next. So a lot still remains to be seen here, but significant headline out of Saudi Arabia yesterday.
Now to Wall Street, the stock market continued its multi-day free fall on Tuesday as the trade war with Canada continues. On Tuesday, President Trump began the day by announcing plans to raise tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum imports to 50%. That's 50. 6 hours later, he reversed course and said that that was no longer the plan. Trump's plan to double the import tariffs was actually a response to Ontario's decision to slap a 25% tax on electricity exports to the United States.
And that Canadian tariff was in response to Trump's original tariff. So just to recap here for all of you keeping score at home, over the course of the last week, Trump went first with 25% tariffs on Canada. Canada then countered with counter tariffs against the U.S. Ontario, the individual province there, their version of states up there, upped with their own because it turns out certain parts of this country we buy electricity from Canada. That's how interlinked our countries are. We're always looking for, what's the cheapest way to get power various places. So Ontario upped with tariffs against the U.S. when it comes to electricity. That's when Trump then upped yesterday with his own new tariffs on aluminum and steel. So that last bit, those last two things, the Ontario electricity tariffs and the U.S. counter tariffs on aluminum and steel, those are gone, but those first part, those other tariffs, for the most part, still in place.
It's literally, I'll see your 25% and I'll raise you 50%.
Yes, Trump started the match about 7 days ago here, where it's like watching a tennis match, right, Joe? Like, you're moving your head back and forth, like, they hit the ball, they hit the ball, they hit the ball. Can't take a break.
So there's now a meeting set up in Washington for tomorrow for the leader of Ontario to talk about a renewed trilateral trade agreement. Also on Wednesday, the president met with the nation's top CEOs, part of a business roundtable. Many of those CEOs concerned what all this chaos in Washington, D.C. is doing to the economy. The bottom line, it is very unpredictable. And as we have talked about, markets don't like uncertainty.
No. Not at all. They want to know what's going to happen. They want predictability. And there is a way to give the markets predictability when it comes to tariffs, but that takes away the surprise factor here for Trump. Because remember, he's using tariffs here partially as a leverage tool that he wants to be able to just announce them one day and get something from another country. But this has ramifications for the economy, for Wall Street right now. And they're hoping to get their heads around what is happening. They're hoping that a couple former Wall Streeters that are senior in Trump's cabinet, you got Howard Lutnick, formerly of Cantor Fitzgerald, over as Commerce Secretary. You got Scott Bessent, hedge funder, finance guy extraordinaire as Treasury Secretary. And the message behind the scenes is, hey, can you guys slow this down? You know how we roll over here, especially that whole talk that we might need a recession. We don't like that talk here on Wall Street. We want things to keep rocking and rolling as they have. There were record all-time highs in recent weeks there. But unfortunately, no luck, at least not as of last night. Jill, Howard Lutnick over on CBS saying that Trump's economic policies are totally worth it, even if they lead to recession. So that talk continues here. You did have Trump yesterday, though, say there won't be a recession. So just a lot of different voices. They're not speaking in unison right now. And that's part of the reason you're seeing what's unfolding when it comes to the stock market and overall predictions when it comes to the economy.
So I was reading the Semaphore newsletter on Tuesday, and I thought they made a really good point. They said Trump's problem is that markets are hard to bully. The other side can't be threatened with a primary challenge or squeezed by regulators. The president is virtually undefeated in one-on-one negotiations, calling out heads of state and wayward Republicans to get what he wants. But markets are different. They don't answer to anybody. This is an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, and the resulting standoff will be expensive.
Yeah, there's no like a Zelensky in charge of the stock market that you can just negotiate with, right? There are millions and millions of Zelenskys, and they will all trade, and in many cases, they might go in the same direction if they all have similar fears about what's happening. Now, as far as Trump's goals here, you hear it from the administration, you hear it from him all the time. This short-term pain, this temporary pain, It's unclear how painful it'll be and how short-term it'll be, but the goal here is ultimately to bring more production back to the U.S., even things out with the world, meaning companies will produce more of their goods here in the U.S., and our products will be more competitive globally. Jill, I shared a map yesterday showing a global map in 2000 and a map of the world in 2024, and which country, China or the U.S., was the largest trading partner of the 190 or so countries around the world. And what you see, and I guess they depicted China in red for obvious reasons, US in blue, and you see in 2000, majority of the world still trading with the US. By 2024, all you're left with is basically North America and Western Europe as the majority trading partners for the US. And it's notable that like the two major tariff fights we've been picking so far is North America and potentially here Western Europe. He's been threatening them with tariffs as well. So what does that mean? Unclear, but certainly the feeling of the White House is to undo some of this damage in the past couple of decades. This is the strategy. Folks on Wall Street, other folks on Wall Street might say, we take a different approach here. But there are some headlines the White House is pointing to. Hyundai and Honda, the two automakers, both say they're looking at potentially adding factories here in the U.S. Again, when we're talking about adding factories, this could be years down the road. LG Electronics looking to potentially make refrigerators in Tennessee instead of Mexico. The spirit maker Campari, they're looking at the U.S. potentially for some production here. So they're pointing, saying, listen, these tariffs are actually forcing some companies to say, hey, we want to stay competitive. We don't want to pay tariffs. We'll look into coming to the U.S. Again, nothing firm yet, but certainly directionally, the White House points to that as victory there. Jill, I know we have a lot more to get to in the podcast, including the speed read, but just before we leave this economic story, I do want to explain one term many of you may be seeing out there in the coming days and weeks, stagflation. So we're all familiar by now, sadly, with inflation, right? As prices go up. But typically inflation is coupled with economic growth. So while we are seeing price increases, that typically happens as the economy is rocking and rolling. In fact, is overheated, is growing too much, too quickly, why you see those prices go up. When things slow down, inflation comes down, but you start to see a slower economy. Sometimes it goes to a crawl. If it goes in reverse, that's a recession. Now, somewhere in between sort of the worst case scenario is something they call stagflation. And that's what economists right now are worried about, that this combination of tariffs and these other factors are getting to. Stagflation would mean that inflation goes back up again, but the economy doesn't grow, as in stagnant inflation, hence stagflation. So they're worried about stagflation, which, again, we could see prices go up, but we wouldn't see the economic growth and the low unemployment that we've seen in recent years. So that's something to be aware of and a term you may be hearing thrown about here.
Okay, time for the speed read from the Associated Press. The U.S. House passed legislation Tuesday that would fund the government through the end of September. Their hope is to avert what would have been a government shutdown at the end of this week when the government is set to run out of funding Friday night. The bill passed nearly completely along party lines. All but one Republican voted for it. All but one Democrat voted against it. The funding bill now moves to the Senate, where Democrats are facing a political dilemma over whether to support it and hand Trump an opportunity to pursue his agenda for another 6 months at least, or oppose it and then risk being blamed for a government shutdown. In the Senate, 60 votes are necessary to pass the measure. Republicans have 53 votes, meaning at least 7 Democrats are going to need to vote with Republicans to keep the government open.
And they have much more pressure than the House Democrats, Jill, because the House Democrats, for the most part yesterday, could vote against it, knowing that it would essentially pass. It was on Republicans with the majority there to get it done. Now, over in the Senate, if Democrats reject it or lead to a government shutdown, easily can be pinned on the Democrats. Republicans will say in the Senate, listen, we had the votes, the House passed it. Democrats, 7 of them. It took 7 of them to keep the government open. But there's a lot of issues with the bill that Democrats have concerns about. There are cuts to VA health. Government spending is, for the most part, flat, except for an increase in spending in the military. But it won't include any funds for any projects in any districts or states. It also forces a cut of $1 billion from the D.C. budget. And I should note, D.C. folks point out to me that they actually kept to budget this year, slightly under budget. So this will be very difficult for Washington, D.C. But most significantly, for Democrats, these temporary extensions do not explicitly direct how federal funding levels should be allocated. So regular spending bills, they can say the Department of X, can spend this amount. This temporary extension actually gives the Trump administration even more discretion over major amounts of money here at a time where Trump is cutting major programs, entire agencies, major parts of the government. And so they feel like this is Congress handing over their authority when it comes to determining what to spend. That's their Article 1 constitutional authority, and handing it over to the president. Democrats particularly concerned here. But notably, one of the reasons why Democrats will probably keep the government open, Jill, is they're concerned on how Trump might use a government shutdown, that he might really like a government shutdown and might keep the government shut down for a while, and it might give him different powers that he hasn't tried yet. We've been talking about on the podcast, for years, various presidents have expanded their executive authority. Trump among them, Trump taking things to new levels here in this term in terms of how much he thinks the government should be able to do, or how much he thinks the White House should be able to do with executive authority. And so how much would he be able to do during a government shutdown? So that's adding to some angst here for Democrats, and likely the reason why you'll see some Senate Democrats vote to keep the government open, despite the fact they don't love the bill here. Jill, while we stay in Washington, there's so many headlines coming out of Washington. I'll just hit on one more. Trump had this Tesla car show, effectively, at the White House yesterday on the driveway. He was concerned about Elon Musk, who has lost personal value, Jill. This year, Elon Musk has lost $130 billion in personal net worth. Now, he is still the richest man in the world, worth just under $300 billion, but he was worth closer to $450 billion at one point recently. And Tesla stock down significantly this year. And so Trump has said, listen, I'm going to help you with that backlash personally. And he brought out all of their new Tesla models to the driveway. He had an event with Elon yesterday, 30 minutes in front of the media, where he effectively tested out and sat in each car. He said he was going to purchase a car. It was a whole to-do unlike anything we've ever seen before.
It felt like a sponsorship, right? Like if your company hired you to promote its product, that's sort of something that you would have done. Tesla stock, as you've been mentioning, down 50% this year. That is a very significant drop, although notably Tesla shares closed up about 3.8% Tuesday, regaining some ground from Monday's losses. Although Trump frequently attacked electric vehicles during last year's campaign, he told reporters that he's heard good things about Teslas from his friends. He appeared to like the Model S, which sells for between $74,000 and $89,000. He also said he bought a Cybertruck for his granddaughter. Now, because of ethical restraints, it is extremely rare for a senior government official, let alone a sitting president, to endorse a consumer product so explicitly.
Yeah, that was what one of the things that was unique here is that he's like, literally, I'm Donald Trump, a spokesperson for Tesla. But he, of course, is very close to Elon Musk. We told you about some of the backlash Tesla is facing, including that there have been violent incidents where windows have been broken, windshields have been broken, Tesla dealerships facing vandalism, chargers set on fire across the country. We should note, Jill, as he bought those Teslas yesterday, he did acknowledge he hasn't driven for years, and Secret Service will probably not let him drive this car. He said, maybe I'll let the staff drive the car. So we'll see what happens. But certainly a number of people noting that, again, the ethical concerns there of the president endorsing a product explicitly at the White House in a way that we haven't seen others do.
From NBC News, an update on the Menendez brothers case. Newly elected Los Angeles County District Attorney Nathan Hochman announced earlier this week his intent to withdraw the previous DA's motion for resentencing Lyle and Eric Menendez. You might remember them as the brothers who are serving life sentences for murdering their parents in 1989. Their trials were widely watched in the 90s, and then they recently were featured in a documentary and second series on Netflix. And that led to talk that it might be time to reconsider their sentence with no parole. So while his predecessor, George Gascon, was open to their potential freedom after 3 decades, the new DA, Hochman, thinks that their decades-long self-defense claims are lies and stated his opposition to their release in a statement. He said the Menendez brothers need to, quote, sincerely and fully accept complete responsibility for all their criminal actions, acknowledge that the self-defense defense was phony and their parents weren't going to kill them, and finally come clean with the court, with the public, with the DA's office.
Yeah, for those unfamiliar with the case, the Menendez brothers, this was the trial of the century until OJ. There were a couple of those in California then in the early 90s. The Menendez brothers killed their parents in 89, claimed during the trial that they killed their parents because they thought their parents would kill them first. Now, there does not appear to be evidence of that. Now, what there is evidence of that led to a hung jury in the first trial, but then a conviction in the second trial, was there was a lot of evidence of sexual assault particularly by the father, against the Menendez brothers. Now, that evidence was used in the first trial, but then was not allowed in the second trial. And so that is why they think that they basically got an unfair shake in that second trial by that second judge. The jury then, in that second trial, convicted them for life, no parole. They've been in prison now for 30 plus years. Now you've now had family members come out saying, yeah, no, we do believe, and some of these are like siblings of their parents, say, yeah, no, they sexually abused these guys. They should be released from prison. The family here very upset with this new DA saying that, listen, Eric and Lyle were repeatedly abused, feared for their lives. They've atoned for their actions. They were in their early 20s when they murdered their parents. They're now in their mid 50s. It is time for them to be able to leave prison here. So we're going to be watching this big hearing next week, March 20th and 21st. But again, the DA is not making that motion anymore, but there are a number of avenues the Menendez brothers are pursuing here, and we'll be talking about all of it. For those of you interested, over on the Mo News Premium account, we'll be doing a workshop, a live Zoom workshop next week with somebody who covered that trial back in the 90s, who will break down the case for all of us. We'll go into the Netflix series and all things Menendez coming up on Mo News Premium. And we know the URL for that, right, Jill? Mo.news/no-brainer. It is actually the URL now. We suggested it. Ren made it happen. So if you want to join Mo News Premium and access the workshops, the premium feed, weekend news, the URL, simple to remember, mo.news/no-brainer.
Now to the NTSB's preliminary report on the deadly January plane and chopper collision in D.C. From the Wall Street Journal, the NTSB is making urgent safety recommendations after that deadly D.C. plane crash. The National Transportation Safety Board recommended permanent restrictions on helicopters flying near Reagan Washington National Airport while certain runways are in use. The Safety Board issued the recommendations Tuesday along with its preliminary report into the January 29th midair collision between an Army helicopter and an American Airlines regional jet. 67 people were killed. The NTSB chair, Jennifer Homendy, says she is still concerned about significant potential for a future mid-air collision at that airport. The NTSB is investigating the accident. It urged the FAA to disallow helicopter traffic at Reagan along a certain route while the runway the plane attempted to land at was still in use. That runway was the destination of the American plane when the Army helicopter crashed into it, sending both aircraft into the Potomac River.
So under the current route in D.C., and we've talked about how busy these skies over D.C. are, a helicopter operating along the Potomac River, that's the river that separates D.C. from Virginia and is right there where they land at the airport. Under current rules, a helicopter at maximum altitude could just have 75 feet of separation from an airplane approaching that runway 33 there at National Airport. Way too close for comfort. Jill, the numbers are remarkable here. The NTSB has found that aircraft's proximity to helicopters have triggered at least one collision warning a month at the airport, starting in 2011 going through 2024. Again, once a month, there's apparently a collision warning due to choppers and planes being too close to each other. That is like over 150 collision warnings, if my math is right here, over the last 14 years or so. In over half these instances, the helicopter may have been flying higher than allowed. And again, we know that that was probably the case here with that collision in January. So, by the way, as somebody who flies frequently into DC, that is a scary statistic to be aware of. We know how busy the skies are. In DC, you got the military, and you got the Park Police, and you got the Secret Service, and you got MPD, you got local DC police, private jet traffic coming in, and you got the commercial jet traffic coming in a relatively small area. Some of those areas you can't fly over because you have no fly areas over the White House, over the Capitol, which are all very close to the airport. So it appears here that there are some major safety recommendations, and let's hope that they get implemented pretty quickly there.
Staying with aviation news from CNN, months after ditching its open seating policy, Southwest Airlines is ending its most recognizable perks. Free checked baggage. The airline will start charging for the first and second checked bags starting on May 28th. However, members of its A-list loyalty program, holders of its branded credit card, or those traveling on a business fare will be exempt from the fees. It is a seismic shift for Southwest, which has always offered free checked bags since the airline started about 60 years ago. It has kept the policy in place even when competitors started to add a ton of fees. In fact, the carrier had trademarked Bags fly free. That is one of their slogans and has been a key part of their advertising. Last year, the CEO said they had no plans to start charging for checked bags, and that no fees for the first 2 bags is a big part of what attracts people to Southwest behind fares and its schedule.
Well, Southwest, just like the rest of us, just like the other airlines now. But interestingly, the CEO, after he said that last year, his views changed as he started seeing how tickets bought through third-party websites, like people who buy Southwest tickets through Google Flights or through Kayak, showed that customers were choosing price regardless of how generous Southwest policies were. So basically, they weren't gaining any new customers over the baggage policy. That ultimately was the ticket price, and that's what mattered the most, even though everyone kind of goes into it knowing that unless you have status, you are going to be charged for checked baggage. They've had to introduce a number of changes here. Elliott Investment Management took a nearly $2 billion stake in Southwest last year. And so these private equity guys are coming in there and saying, we got to change some things here at Southwest to increase profitability, increase efficiency. And as we've mentioned, one of the other big changes at Southwest, that open seating is gone. Assigned seating will soon be introduced, as well as premium seats. They've also rolled out red-eye flights. Basically, Southwest, pretty much like everybody else now.
And now to another travel story from the New York Post. A viral air travel trend has taken over social media. Travelers are participating in what's called the airport theory trend. It means they arrive at the airport just 15 minutes before their plane is supposed to depart. A TikTok video shows a flyer setting a timer for 15 minutes as they walk towards security. After 13 minutes, the TikToker reveals that they successfully made it to their gate in time to catch the flight. But another TikTok user posted a PSA saying, for those of you thinking about testing out airport theory, and then the user flashes to a shot showing the gate monitor reading, flight closed, meaning that the traveler missed their flight. So the user concluded, don't do it.
Shocker. What's the point? What are you gaining by doing flight theory, friends? I will say, Jill, until I had a family and a daughter, I did like to really cut it very close. I do have a TSA pre, and I also have a Clear membership, which helps at most airports. But, at the end of the day, sometimes they decide to flag your bag, and then there's no TSA person available to look through the bag and find whatever or confirm that there was nothing in your bag. And when you're cutting it that close, that's super, super, super on the edge, especially if flights are overbooked these days. So getting on another flight, super challenging. I will say that the whole guidance about getting there 2 hours before, that's likely not necessary. Again, unless you have kids and you just want to, have peace of mind. And that, of course, the whole idea of getting there 2 hours before, that's because, they want you to spend some time at the airport. They want you to spend some money at the airport. And that's the incentive there for the 2 hours before. But if you have TSA pre and you have Clear, you typically can get away with. Jill, when do you like to arrive, based on departure?
I'm just thinking that if anyone listens to your advice and then misses their flight, don't blame me. You can
Jill's
blame Moshe.
Get there 3 hours before.
I'm with you, Moshe. I used to cut it a lot closer, but now that I travel usually with my kids and my husband, we get there early because the stress isn't worth it. I'd rather have.
So are you there 2 hours before departure?
I wouldn't say 2 hours before, but we're there pretty early.
Yeah.
And I don't think that either my husband or I can relax until we're through security.
Yes. Right. Especially if you check baggage, especially with kids, you got to check the baggage, which I hate, but whatever, you got to do it. And then the whole security arrangement, which you never know. You never know. Machines are down, lack of staffing. Some days it's super, super quick. I don't know if anyone's tried the digital ID. They have that at a few airports. I have it through Delta at LaGuardia. That's even quicker than a TSA pre and the Clear sometimes, digital ID. But it's only available at a few airports.
I guess the moral of the story is you want to live on the edge. Sure, get there 15 minutes before, but that feels a little insane. Crazy.
Then you're just reenacting the Home Alone scene of running through the airport. And some airports are super large, and then it depends on what gate. And then they stick you at a gate all the way at the end of the. Anyway, it's not worth it running through airports. And also, key advice: connections. Stay away from connections less than 60 minutes. That's also cutting it super close. I like to keep my connection time above 60 minutes. Between 60 minutes to 2 hours. 2 hours sucks, but I don't know, 45-minute connections freak me out. For more travel tips, Jill, hit me up over on the premium account. I'll talk about all the various things. On this day in history, in 1804, Samuel Chase, here's a fun fact for you, the only Supreme Court justice to ever be impeached. President Thomas Jefferson at the time was actually trying to clear the courts of people appointed by the previous party, the Federalists, George Washington's party. So Jefferson wanted to get the Supreme Court justice impeached. This is why I like to remind folks who are like freaked out sometimes. I was like, have you looked at our country's history? Literally Thomas Jefferson, who we have like a huge memorial to and people like revere and hold up as like a top 5 president, he literally was like, I didn't like that the other guy appointed the Supreme Court justice. I want him impeached. Initially, he was impeached by the House, but they failed to muster a 2/3 majority in the Senate. Therefore, he was acquitted and stayed on the court. It was seen as a victory for judicial independence and established the precedent that a judge could not be removed as a result of just stating his political views. And so interesting history there when it comes to the Supreme Court, especially since that comes up so often. A bit of literary history on this day in 1957, The Cat in the Hat by Theodore Geisel, aka Dr. Seuss, was first published on this day 68 years ago. Geisel at the time was working as a children's book author and illustrator, and he worked on the Dick and Jane books. These are books written for young children back in the day. His issue, Dick and Jane, boring. Teachers knew it. Parents knew it. The boring characters, he thinks, impeded children from actually learning how to read, advance their skills. And so he decided to go with Cat in the Hat in those various books. Jill, right now, Olivia is a big fan of Hop on Pop, speaking of Dr. Seuss books.
Moshe, that's a really cute one. And I also love and highly recommend Wacky Wednesday. Olivia is too young for it, but I never read that when I was a kid. And Alex and I have so much fun with it. Still, it's just like a fun book to read.
Speaking of fun, let's get to the end here of On This Day in History, a little Broadway history for all of you. Do you hear the people sing? On this day in 1987, the musical Les Mis opened on Broadway. It was adapted from Victor Hugo's novel of the same name, premiering on this day in 87. And it ran nearly 7,000 performances, Jill, ending in 2003, one of the longest running shows in Broadway history.
One that I have never seen.
You haven't seen the film either?
No, it's really,
Jill.
I think, maybe I shouldn't admit it.
No, yeah, it's fine to admit. But I think that when you admit these things, you then have to then proceed by making what you're watching this weekend the Les Mis film, or at least the recording of the Broadway show, which you can also probably watch on one of the streamers, or I'll send you a YouTube link for it. Jill, the music is phenomenal. The show is phenomenal. Master of the House, Dona Fuma play.
I know the music. That's the funny part.
Yeah, it has like so many catchy tunes. It's great. Speaking of catchy tunes, on this day, 31 years ago, the song, of course, is I Saw the Sign by Ace of Base. It reached #1 on the Billboard charts on this day in 1994. Jill, I remember getting the tape cassette at my local record store. I sound so old. I got the tape cassette of Ace and Base, The Sign, and played it on repeat. My brother and I remember in middle school.
Ace of Base had a bunch of hits, and then they kind of just went away.
Yeah, but what hits, Jill?
But huge hits.
Like Don't Turn Around. And then you had like I Saw the Sign. And then you had All That She Wants Is a Little Baby. Like you listen, they gave us like really incredible hits there in this early 90s. And they didn't have to. I expect nothing more from Ace of Base. I think they gave music, they gave society the contribution that we needed.
It was enough. Thank you, Ace of Base. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Ace of Base. I mean, literally between the Swedes, what did they get? Among other things, they gave us ABBA, right? And then they gave us Ace of Base. And then their songwriters behind the scenes gave us like most of those hits for Backstreet Boys and Sync, etc. So the Swedes really have made a remarkable contribution to music history. Also, where is Spotify from? Sweden. So really, I think punching above their weight based on their population. Globally, the Swedes really, their contribution to music. Thank you, Sweden.
Yes, I've been thanking Ace of Base, but I should really just be thanking the country of Sweden. Thank you. And thank you guys for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. We'd really appreciate it.
I'm so glad that everyone who listens to this podcast saw the sign and this podcast opened up their eyes. Life and news is demanding without understanding the news. I'm glad that you saw the sign and this podcast opened up your eyes. There you go.
Moshe, you're done. You've lost it.
Listen, I think that under the pale moon, for so many years I've wondered who you are. I'm going to go listen to them right now.
Moshe, I think we potentially have a new theme song.
Yeah, we have to go license. That's going to cost us money, Joe. We'll have to go talk. But given the praise we've given Ace of Base, maybe they'll cut us a deal.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.